Hi everybody, my name is Ryder, and today I'm going to be reviewing HBO's newest series, The Last of Us, which just wrapped up its first season on HBO Max. So like I mentioned in a previous video, this show follows a smuggler and a young girl on a cross-country trip through the zombie apocalypse, and they're traveling all this distance in the hopes that this young girl who's immune to this infection, that she will be the key to creating a cure for this virus. This show is based on a video game series of the same name, and this first season is specifically adapting the first game's story, but you don't need to know anything about those games or have played them in order to jump into this show. So I should preface this review by saying I am a huge fan of The Last of Us games, and so my favorite part of watching this show was actually getting to see all the original scenes that they had written just for the show. I don't know if it's just me, but whenever they recreated a scene from the game line for line, it always sounded a little off to me. I think this must be because I have played The Last of Us through so many times and I've heard these lines of dialogue over and over again. And so to hear new actors reading these lines was just very jarring for me. But thankfully, I don't think this is going to be an issue for anybody new going to the show. But I also wonder if anybody else who's played the games before also experienced this. So anyway, because of this nitpick of mine, I really loved when there were new scenes between Joel and Ellie that we had never seen in the game before. In episode 4 really stood out to me for this reason. There was some really good new dialogue between them that really got to me and really touched me, especially involving Ellie's pun book towards the end of that episode that I will just always associate with these characters when I'm thinking of any version of them, whether that's from the TV show or the game. And speaking of new stuff, episode 3 really scratches that itch. They really put Joel and Ellie to the side for this episode, and they center the whole thing around this minor character from the first game and another character whose corpse is the only thing we ever saw of them in that first game. And they create this whole love story between the two of them that was only ever hinted at, and that players never really got to see for themselves. And I just think it is so cool that they took this very minor aspect from the first game and they centered a whole episode around it, and it ended up being by far the best episode of the season. Listening to all the positive reactions from LGBTQ fans on how the show depicts queer love and relationships has been really great to hear. It's not something I can speak to personally, but queer representation is pushed much more to the forefront in the show than it is in the game, and I think it is so great that we are getting that in such a popular show. As I watch the show, I also listen to the accompanying podcast where the writers talk about, they share behind-the-scenes secrets and the making of each episode, and one thing I've heard them repeat a few times is how the show features significantly less action than the game does, and the reason for that is they were worried about boring the audience. When you're playing the game, you're the one in control when killing infected and other enemies, and it's pretty much impossible to translate that interactive experience to film, so I understand where they're coming from. But a benefit from all those violent encounters in the game is that by the end of that story, you really understand how Joel and Ellie had to go through hell in order to get where they are, and that's something I don't think the show does as well getting across to the audience. And so I think the show really would have benefited from a few more sequences where Joel and Ellie are really having to fight for their lives. And very often the infected took a backseat to the story, which I think they should, but I often just completely forgot that they were there at all, and I think that they should serve as a much more consistent threat. All this to say that I am very curious to see how Season 2 plays out in adapting the second game's story, because a major part of that game's story is about the violence you commit during gameplay, and so I'm interested to see how they're going to handle that. I'm not a reader at all, and so this is one of the very first times I've ever seen a story I'm super familiar with be adapted from one medium to film, and so that made watching this show a very unique experience for me, and one that I don't think most people who haven't played the game are going to have. Based on the reception of the show, I feel like I'm in the minority with how much it affected me. I had a good time with it, and I think it is a solid first season, but it just doesn't hit me nearly as hard as the game does. But most people who are watching this show really seem to love it, and that honestly does make me really happy. I think the reason this show didn't hit as hard for me was because I never had any real desire to see The Last of Us turned into a show or a movie. Like I mentioned before, episode 3 was by far my favorite, and it's the episode that featured the most original new stuff that we had never seen in the game before, and that's what worked so well for me. If I had it my way, I really would have loved for this show to have been an anthology series. Each episode would feature a completely new cast and take place in different locations, but all set within the world of The Last of Us. It wouldn't require any prior knowledge of the game, and so it would be accessible to new viewers, but it would also help to develop and build out that world and just show how many other stories there are to tell besides Ellie and Joel's. And that would also help to fix the issue with the show that we got. There wouldn't be a need for action that is needed for Joel and Ellie's story. The infected would obviously still show up, but they could function differently rather than just not showing up for big stretches of time. Like I've said, the best part of this show for me is that there are just going to be more fans of The Last of Us now. Most people aren't going to have the issues with this show that I did, and I still overall had a very positive experience with it and had a good time watching it. So if you haven't seen it yet, I definitely recommend it. And that's all I have for today. I hope to be back with another review very soon. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you all in the next video.